join, but while we're here, we wanted to offer the ground rules for the session tonight. Tree, would you like me to take this on for tonight? Or would you like to? I can pass the mic if you like.
You can take it on.
Okay. So, welcome everybody. So we like to offer ground rules to the Just Food training. So first, while folks are getting settled in, please, if you haven't done already, add your name to the screen. We will keep folks on mute until it's full group prompts and any group exercises or questions. Please use the chat. So the chat is for, it's an active chat throughout the training. So we encourage folks to share through the chat. If there's links that you want to share, if there's questions to the prompts when we're talking to the full group, that is a good place. It's also a good place for points that might need a little bit more time to grow on. So we also use the chat actively in the training, as well as a community garden plot. So if there's talking points or talking points or ideas that might take a little bit more time than we have tonight together to kind of think about or to share or to reflect on, add it to the chat. We have the working session tomorrow that we'll be able to expound on more. So definitely use that, and we'll be recording the chat. And we also encourage folks, because this is virtual, to try to get as much interaction from folks as possible. So while you're live, if you want to like thumbs up or jazz fingers, that's great. But Zoom also offers the options for reaction. So we really love to see that. It gives us some indication on where folks are landing, and also for the other community folks to see. So if there's a comment that really resonates for you, you can snap. If you want to share, please raise your hand. You can use the reaction buttons for that. Some folks put a star in the chat so we know to call on you. Great. All right.
Amazing.
We'll keep going. How about next screen? So thanks again for joining us tonight on the live repeat. So we're gonna just do session 1 again, but with you folks. Session 1 is centering equity in the regional food value chain. So this is part of the larger Fresh Connect series that Just Food is hosting in sponsorship from New York State Ag and Markets. And it's part of our, what we've been calling a community food project design and planning series. So tonight we have, happy to be here. This is me talking, Kiana Mickey, Special Projects Consultant for Just Food. And we also have with us Tree Williams, who is a longstanding community Just Food chain community chef and advocate in her own right, as well as community chef Sia and advisory committee member as well, Sia Pickett, helping us on Zoom on the back end. So we'll be the facilitators for tonight's training, but we definitely welcome dynamic chat engagement and community engagement from the participants in the training. So a little bit about Just Food to kind of ground us and kick us off for tonight. For folks who don't know, like Just Food is a nonprofit, NYC-based nonprofit. We've been around as a nonprofit organization for about 25 years, but within the last 3 years have shifted our mission to increase the power, health, and wealth of historically and economically marginalized communities. So we see food as a driver for change, and we try to be a capacity building organization to develop community-driven solutions to inequities in our food system. So when we talk about equity, we're really trying to hold the intersectionality of equity, or what we're trying to achieve, So that's really lifting up the economic, racial, and environmental equity. So that really kind of is the core that kind of holds us all. But if we're also holding an equity lens, we know that disproportionately folks of color, mixed income, low income folks, and other historically marginalized communities are impacted differently than others. But this is how we're able to root and work together. And so, you know, we feel it's important to kind of highlight the importance of an equity lens, not just in language or rhetoric, but how we actively evolve the organization. And what has rooted us in building this lens to the work, to staffing, to programming, and to leadership is that we want to, as much as possible, acknowledge the diversity, inequities, and complexity that historically and economically marginalized communities experience when building community-driven solutions. So there's no way to genuinely and authentically do this work in community without that being part of our praxis, as well as how we share it with others that want to engage in community-based work. And so, oh, yeah, sorry, Tree.
Can I jump in to give you a
please.
Okay, so hi everyone, it is awesome to be here, and in order to build community, first we have to agree on community. And today we have established some very simple community agreements. One, we're asking everybody to listen actively. I have to take a step back and say that I really appreciate everyone being here. It is a Monday in September. And thank you all so much for taking the time and being present with us tonight. And our goal is to have everyone benefit tremendously from being in this space. And in addition to asking everyone to listen with tremendous presence, we're also asking that when you have your opportunities to share, that it becomes that moment to really share the things that have been present for you, right? So the more dynamic you're sharing, the more dynamic the community that you're able to build. One mic, one speaker. We are not, tomorrow is our working session, our fourth and final session. And so that will be more of an opportunity for us to share our voices in the room. However, our chat box is going to be where all of the action is. And so we encourage everybody to thoughtfully put your responses in the chat box in a way that other folks can read it and really take in what you are saying. And the principle of step up, step back, we are all coming from different points of expertise. And we want to be able to welcome everybody's point of view and expertise. And so as we're communicating things through the chat box, let's think about how to intentionally create the space for everyone's contribution to be thrown in, right? The chat box items from today will go into our working session tomorrow, which will hopefully build a stronger community praxis out of this particular training. So.
Yes, thank you. Awesome. And so we've kind of envisioned like taking us on a road or a roadmap. So just wanted to highlight that the sessions are recorded, and where we're at now is on 9/28. We, doing a live repeat of session 1, and like Tree said, having session 3 tomorrow. So for tonight's agenda, we will be walking through the spectrum of food security, food justice, and food sovereignty. We'll be talking about the concept around food apartheid, and also the how solidarity models and community food project models can decrease food apartheid, how increasing self-determination will do that. And then we'll have a break, and then we'll jump into some project planning, some early steps to kind of help folks understand, or some tools to help them get on the road to thinking about a project in full.
So if I can jump in, right? I would love to take us through the spectrum of food security, food justice, and food sovereignty. So to begin, you mentioned a very important word earlier, and that word is equity. And because we're all coming from different places, I just want to take a moment to set some base definitions. And so equity and equality are not the same, right? So equality is functioning from this understanding that everybody has the same needs, wants, basic desires. Equity is lifting up the fact that we are all individuals and have specific needs, wants, and desires, and looks at how to shift systems and practices in order to give people what they need to get to where they're trying to go, right? And so as we begin to dive into the spectrum of food security, food justice, and food sovereignty, to that, I just want to take a moment to look at and lift up the word sovereignty and recognize that sovereignty is talking about the ways in which we are autonomous, independent, and self-determined. Okay, now, this slide is full of very rich information, right? And you will have access to this information once the training is over. So we use the term food security quite a bit in this work. And my first time coming in contact with the term food security came through my work with Just Food, which began over a decade ago. I really love this working definition from the United Nations World Food Summit, right? Food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious foods to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy lifestyle. We can look at this through multiple lenses. We can talk about food security from the individual onus to be able to have what it is that they need to feed themselves and their families nutritiously. We can also look at food security from the community lens, how a community is able to get the components necessary to have food that is accessible, culturally relevant, and carries on particular food ways. When I think about the way Just Food as an organization approaches food security, so much of it is lifting up and honoring the fact that community is able to determine its basic needs for food that is considered safe, nutritious, in a way that is accessible. And so food security begins with and is grounded in how people choose that for themselves. The other really important point that I want to jump into is this notion of food justice, right? And this is Just Food's working definition of food justice. Food justice is communities exercising their right to grow, sell, and eat healthy food. It builds an environment where people can participate fully in their community and where democracy, economic justice, and racial, gender, and other social equity can thrive. There's that word equity again. So when we think about food justice from a community perspective, it's this democratic process around the advocacy pieces, right? The work as activists in the realm of food justice that creates the framework so that people in communities can work together to self-select what they need in terms of food, how it's being delivered, and how food becomes this gateway to other moments and other points of access for advocacy. The other things that I want to jump into are this notion of food sovereignty. So one, food sovereignty being a basic human right. Two, agrarian reform as an essential piece of food sovereignty. What is agrarian reform? Thinking about situations in which people are landless and providing that to them. Or looking at situations where farms move from these large corporate models back to the family models, right? In our training last week, I really want to bring up this particular example because it was phenomenal. One of the participants was in a farm school set up out on the West Coast. All of the graduates were provided with a 1/4 acre of land for 5 years at $9 a month. That's food sovereignty in action, right? So not only are people getting the tools to learn how to work the land, here organizationally, they're provided with the space in order to do so, right? Protecting natural resources is crucial to this notion of food sovereignty, because if we do not have an earth to grow food, right, none of us can make self-determined choices about how we eat. Reorganizing food trade, prioritizing production for consumption versus trade. I told this example before. I remember about roughly like 7, 8 years ago, learning for the first time that there was a whole commodity stock market independent of the stock market that we think of in terms of buying and selling. So this notion that food is traded as a commodity is so disheartening on so many levels, because it creates these roadways in which corporate interest is valued more than the ways in which people can have fair and equitable access to the foods that they need. And so food sovereignty is working to make these channels available to people so that, for example, there are opportunities to lobby and ways to create policy so that there are fair prices around food, or there are greater warehouses set up so that people can move. Yes, corn, soybean, pork bellies, all commodities, right? So we can get cereal for very affordably because they're heavily underwritten and highly traded. How do we begin to help support systems in which the food that we can grow locally and the foods that are culturally relevant? I can see if I can find that and send it to you, Lindsay. How we can get, or to the group, Lindsay, how we can get that kind of support for local food. Also, food sovereignty centering the end of the globalization of hunger. So we are in the middle of a pandemic crisis in this country. And every week without fail, the New York Times is reporting on the increasing rate of hunger right here in the United States. And so for far too long, we've thought about globalized hunger as out there, instead of recognizing that globalized hunger is right here. An organization like Just Food works across so many different platforms in the food justice movement to think about how we can proactively reduce points of food hunger right here in our communities. And that is an essential component of food sovereignty, how to make sure that people are actually able to eat wherever they are. So food sovereignty also centering the end of food as a means of enforcing social peace, right? Moving away from this notion of withholding food, withholding access to resources in order to control populations. And also moving toward the democratic control of farmland and farmed foods. So what does it mean when we are able to work collectively on the policy and advocacy pieces to help our farmers actually not only gain access to land to grow food, and also to keep that land and make it possible for them to bring food to communities nearby that need it, but make sure that the systems are in place so that they're able to have fair laws that support the best practices for growing food. And over the years in my work with Just Food, what that has looked like, tremendous advocacy work around the care for bees in New York City specifically. Tremendous advocacy work around school garden campaigns, advocacy work around self-sustaining, community-sustained agriculture. I said sustained twice, models in neighborhoods, right? And so we think about food security, food justice, and food sovereignty as these three umbrellas. We also need to recognize that it's possible to develop frameworks that connect the three of them in community and also in respect to policy, right? So as we move through today, we're going to come to other pieces that talk about ways in which we can connect into the resources, whether it's technical information, or connecting to institutional support or other trainings in order to make more of this a reality. So I'm going to turn it over to Kiana.
Okay, great. So thank you, Tree. So when we talk about community food projects, a lot of times folks kind of ask us, okay, well, what does that look like? What are those projects? What can I do? How can I support? And at the same time, sometimes folks wonder, like, do I have to start something new? Is there something new I should do, or this thing popped up? So we thought, like, it would be helpful to kind of talk about how community food projects show up in our neighborhoods, but focus on solidarity-based models. So kind of like the groundwork that Tree's been laying down is, a big part of what we see as food justice work moving into food sovereignty is trying to find ways that models that leverage, collective power, try to bring democratic control, connecting to policy, as well as like the folks that are most impacted becoming the decision makers on all fronts of the work and not just end consumers. So when we kind of look at some of the prevailing models, sometimes folks get a little bit confused, so we thought we'd break it up a little bit. So there's like immediate or temporary, immediate or temporary stopgap measures or projects such as mutual aid efforts or free fridges. Most of that food is coming from the emergency model, so it's like surplus or donated or food that was bound for waste. Getting connected to new pop-up groups that are trying to connect folks to that emergency food. So folks might have seen some of those efforts. They kind of mutual aid efforts seem to pop up in times of epidemics and pandemics. So I don't think it's surprising that we saw these kind of efforts pop up in the age of COVID. But I think when we look at historically, what ends up happening is they're really attempting to address stopgap measures while the larger system reknits itself, as opposed to putting energy and solidarity around alternative economies, which are the kind of way working towards food sovereignty that we want. It's really kind of how to use the surplus in that supply chain while the supply chain's having a bottleneck to get it, offset it, and dumped into communities, while that system tries to reknit and come back online, and then you no longer have the bottleneck. It really doesn't speak to the power of the people, the land control, democratic control, land ownership, or community food projects longer term as we, like to focus on. So shifting in that spectrum, there's like emergency food or emergency models. So some folks, that represents very often in food banks and food pantries, rescue, or even farms that kind of grow for food pantries. So it's that intersection between trying to address a need around food insecurity that has been persistent in our communities, but still at a level of connecting surplus food to communities in not a viable way, but in a way that's supposed to address immediate need, but has actually become models that are quite persistent in our communities. So there are very few times it's connected to, say, job creation or revitalization or vitality of like businesses or community groups in that community, but it is kind of bringing food in, but folks have very little choice about the food that they're getting, and there's still this kind of persistent need. So, Tree mentioned, like food insecurity in America, and it's increasing. I believe the number is forecasted, like there are about 18 million, say, children, so 1 in 4 that are living food insecure. And in terms of total numbers, there's about 54 million folks in our country that are likely going to remain food insecure even as COVID continues or persists. So we've had emergency models for a long time trying to address large scale need, but what we're still seeing is that the food insecurity has not decreased. In fact, it continues to ramp up. So what we, moving into the spectrum, what we start to see is wanting to decrease the reliance on charity and find ways to really build vitality, resiliency, and vibrancy from the farm level to the community level. So this is where on the spectrum, you start to see models that are kind of in that midpoint. So, organizations or groups that are maybe connecting to supporting farm viability as opposed to just donations, but the decision-making power are not of and by the people. So it might be work that is in community, but it's not community-driven solutions or work. The most impacted are still usually in the chain as end consumers, as opposed to being decision makers or the folks that become the most activated, whether it's in the policy, in the activation of the work, or even just in the models. So sometimes the models, you'll see things pop up in your community, but they have already had staff and decided how they're going to staff it, as opposed to community deciding what projects there are and the community deciding what food is there, what farmers you're going to engage with, what other value-added products you might want there. So we kind of see this shift or this need for increasing the collective power of self-determination and finding models that kind of fit that. And so that's kind of where we try to support and kind of focus our work at Just Food, is in solidarity-based models, ones that are really supporting an economy that's building a multiplier effect from the farm to community. So there's a direct relationship between your food, how in transparency, that there's also a better transparency around the quality of food, the types of food, the decision on who's bringing that food in, the options to have more than one farmer, and the choice to talk to your farmer. So even at a scale of, we want to connect to a more culturally relevant food, can you grow that in your crop planning for the season to come versus just growing what you feel strongly about? And creating models that offer opportunity for other hyper-local growing. So when we talk about regional food, we're talking about, say, rural within 250 miles. So what folks typically think of farm and farmlands, absolutely, that's connecting to our food shed. But we're also talking about hyper-local production and growing. So we're talking about, how do we find models that can support multiple ways for us to have a stake in the solutions? Are we also supporting farmers and growers, producers, to be environmental stewards in our natural environments as well? So in our communities, how light is it on the land? Are these facilities or sites being maximized? And is this healthy job creation in and of the community? Are these things that folks can come back to? And same on the farmer side, are we finding ways to either find the price points or identify price points or buy from farmers at a fair price, where then they're able to be environmental stewards on that larger piece of land, hire good farm workers, treat them fairly, and have decent and fair labor and harvesting. So all the things that we kind of talk about the price of food kind of goes into that. And so when you have this direct relationship, you're not only connecting to the access of the food, that you're also having a better understanding on the price of food and why it's so important to support that, as well as finding ways for your community to buy into it. So when we say buy into it, it's not just straight transactional price. It's also lifting up sliding scale, revolving loan funds, into connecting to incentives, even things like government funding. These are some of those things that we're historically purposely kept from, and we'll talk more about that in terms of segregation of resources, is that we've been kept so much from the information around resources and policies that really speak to how we're impacted on the ground, how our food is impacted, what comes in our neighborhoods, what's available, what's growing, in abundance and what isn't. And yet so much, or historically purposely kept us from being informing those policies or even seeing ourselves as policy holders and makers. And so what we try to connect to at Just Food is not just helping folks build solidarity-based models, because that is important. There are proven infrastructure and capacity that we can train folks, share resources. So you're connecting to a network of farmers and community leaders and other partners that have some of this ramp and roadway. So we're either connecting to what is still needed to fill in gaps or ways to support each other and be stronger. But we're also trying to find ways to influence the policy and advocacy around the work that we're doing around the food. So again, this is shifting from food just being something that gets dropped in your community for that time and somebody gets a tax break, or a corporation or business gets a tax break, versus is food really a driver of change, a connector of community, and how do we all connect to each other to make sure all of us, no matter our income, race, creed, ethnicity, or race, are able to connect to that food. So there's different models and making sure that they all are able to kind of build and work together. And so I will kick it to Tree to kind of walk us through the concept of food apartheid.
Thank you. So that Shirley was muted. So Kiana gave us some really amazing points to begin to take apart, right? So food apartheid, two definitions. We'll look at both of them and then kind of dig a little bit deeper. So food apartheid affects people of all races, including poor white people, although Black and brown people are affected disproportionately. Under these conditions, which are overtly abusive, whole communities are geographically and economically isolated from healthy food options. Next, food apartheid is the lack of equity and purposeful segregation of resources that keep the most impacted from determining how to feed, grow, thrive in resilient and survive in resilient environments. So there are, again, a multitude of ways in which we can look at this. One of the things that I really want to lift up is that there is no one size fits all for any of this. Each and every one of us on this call is coming to this work from a different place, and each and every one of us will apply a different lens and a different solution for how we show up in communities, right? To begin, food apartheid as it stands is not something that is a cut and dry series of problems. And so, for example, one way in which an organization like Just Food looks at how to address this point of food apartheid is through training community chef educators. One may ask, what does a community chef educator program have to do with food apartheid? Well, if you are partnering to bring a system that trains educators to talk to people about their foodways, how to prepare them, how to procure them, and how to preserve them, you are actually closing the gap that prevents people from having access to the food that they need, right? And so another element of a system that helps to close the gap for food apartheid is working on policy to actually increase the amount of fresh produce or local produce available at bodegas or at local supermarkets, right? And so whether you're working within a bodega association to move the chips to one section, to move the candy to another section, and to bring fresh fruit baskets to the front is just as much a way to tackle food apartheid as if you're going to Albany or whatever capital you live in, whatever your capital is based on where you live, to ask for special protocols around emissions for vehicles that are bringing food in from other places. And when we think about food apartheid, we have to, again, apply that equity component to it, because we have to recognize that what each community needs will vary from community to community. And so earlier, I just want to take a moment to jump back. Kiana she walked us through models that move from charity to solidarity. It's crucial that we think about how to move from charity to solidarity in a constructive way and in a systematic way, because there are many times when we believe that what is considered charitable is automatically good, instead of asking what the actual community needs. And so there are times when maybe we do work to have an emergency pantry pop up or a pantry pop up, but the pantry is not bringing food that is actually beneficial to the community. So if the pantry is stocking canned goods and the community happens to be a local church where the majority of the people who come to the pantry are seniors, those canned goods are not good necessarily for that senior population. So what does it mean to say, how can we actually help feed seniors what they need? Maybe it's delivering food maybe it's actually shopping for them with their EBT and dropping food to them, right? And so unless we begin to have these conversations with community stakeholders around what they need, it's actually virtually impossible to decipher what is most mutually beneficial. So before I jump into more around this piece around food apartheid, I am gonna throw something in the chat box, and I want everybody to take about 3 minutes, right? To think about, really think critically, what does food apartheid mean to you specifically? And what does it look like in your community or your sphere of work? And so you don't necessarily need to speak to your immediate physical neighborhood that you live in, right? Maybe if you do food-based work, that is your sphere of work. So that's your community. So please take a moment to think about what food apartheid means to you and how it shows up. So we are gonna can we get a timer for 3 minutes? And then we go from there. And please type it in the chat. Sorry, I forgot to ask that.
While we let folks type in their answers, your example, Sia, makes me think of something that I heard today on a panel that I was on in Brownsville. And one of the community partners that we have mentioned that in a food pantry distribution, or I guess it was like a food box, one of those commodity food box, they were offering it to seniors, and they had things like large watermelons and hard bread and just other, large butternut squashes. And so these are all like good food or things that most of us want to eat, but as a senior, it just didn't meet their needs in terms of size, in terms of reality of getting it home, preparing it. So what ended up happening is they end up leaving it there at the site. So they're still in need of food. And at the same time, increasing food waste, not on their, not by their fault, but just simply because the model wasn't really built to support that particular community. Or, or have their needs in mind, whether it's cultural needs, seasonal needs, or even something as simple as size and weight in the food.
Yeah, it's very true. In the community I live in, there's a lot of seniors. And they had that particular thing this summer, watermelons. And my landlady's like 84, her friend is down the street around the same. They just took one watermelon in their basket, came to the house, cut it, because it was more than, they're both single women. And what were they going to do with this big old watermelon? And the only reason why they probably took it is because they just lived down the street from the pantry. I'm thinking of all the other seniors that live blocks away and them trying to pull a cart with a big watermelon in it.
Yeah, and it's such a missed opportunity too, as well, because we know the nutrients that can come from watermelon, all the different recipes. I know you probably have a few, Sia, in tree in mind, and if there was a place for that to be, broken down or processed, it could have easily become a watermelon relish or a watermelon soup or another recipe with cultural seasonings and techniques in mind that could have actually been available for many people, as opposed to just that being in that one way, in that model where they're not able to access it as well or easily.
Exactly. So thank you, Saudaya. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Who wrote? Sadaya. Thank you. Food apartheid is an organized system. Big ag, policymakers, large grocers, big farm that works together to turn profit off of stripping communities of culturally relevant, spiritually nourishing foods. Yes, 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 and yes, right? And we're gonna dive into that. And by the way, I see a lot of people on this call, and I didn't see too many in the chat box. Chelsea, thank you. Food apartheid seems to be the root of multiple reform/change efforts, some which might be more temporary, so getting good food to those affected by food isolation, and longer term, working in solidarity towards solutions. In my personal work with food, I've seen more families served by temporary solutions than longer term solutions. And I'm thinking a lot about how we can scale up CSA and other solidarity focused efforts. Excellent. Sam says food apartheid is a system of oppression that denies poor and marginalized communities the ability to meet their nutritional and cultural/culinary needs. Yes to all of these things. And I'm gonna throw something out there that may not be popular. Food apartheid in the United States is present in almost every community in the United States. The reason why I say it is present in almost every community in the United States is because in the last 60 years, the country has shifted, right? From this place of growing food together, being connected to where food comes from, what food looks like, and how food is prepared. And so food apartheid can be as simple as children not knowing what a beet looks like from root to stem to leafy green top, right? Because when we have access to education about what food actually is and how it is actually prepared and best ways in which to consume it, then we can actually begin to make the proper decisions about our individual wellness and planetary wellness. Erica says, I live in the upper Hudson Valley where there are so many incredible farms, yet in my closest city in the country, that there is a lot of work to be done to increase access and education to land and farm fresh food. Yes, exactly, right? And so, yeah, 100%. I grew up in a farm town where there was incredibly limited access to that food for the residents of the town. Thank both of you for putting that in the chat box or that potatoes and French fries are the same thing. Yes, all the time. So thank you all for these things, right? And we need to think about things in these very pliable ways so that we can begin to create strong, sustaining solutions. So let's move forward a couple of slides, if possible, Sia, to this exploration of solidarity-based models, right? And these are examples of ways in which we can strategically begin to tackle issues around food apartheid. 1, something as simple as a farm stand. When I say farm stand, not only do I mean farm stands in urban communities, I mean experiences with farm stands that I've had driving up like the northeastern side of the United States, where there's a box, there's some vegetables, you take some vegetables, you put some money in the box, and you keep on driving, right? So a farm stand that is that type of setup that's without a person doing the transaction is just as impactful as a farm stand where there is a dedicated person there working to help support purchases. So farm stands entail a farmer that is a regional farmer and potentially 1 to 2 hyper-local growers, right? We use the term bona fide regional farmer because, to be honest, some farm stands do get food from outside of New York City, New York State, Connecticut, and New Jersey, beyond the 250 miles. When we begin to highlight farm stands with regional growers, what we begin to do is circulate that money within the community. We are able to make sure that a small farmer is getting that money directly. We are able to build the relationships in our neighborhood, right? So there are toolkits, there are trainings available for all of these types of solidarity-based models. And you can do something as efficient as a farm stand or something as largely sustaining as a wholesaler. We'll circle back to that in a second. So community-run farmers markets, that is another solidarity-based model that brings 2 to 4 farmers and a couple of hyperlocal growers and potentially value-added producers, to this place in a community. What begins to happen at community-run farmers markets? Food that people want, relationships that sustain all parties involved. You have a space that becomes a community hub for sharing recipes and information. It can become this place where kids play, seniors meet each other. It can become the place where organizers rally community members toward effective change. A community farmers market can be anywhere from a street that's blocked off like a play street, which is a whole policy initiative, right? To a moment where it's in the back of a schoolyard, and so you had to work with the principal to make that real, to where it's part of a park. And so you had to, if you're in New York City, for example, reach out to the Parks Department to make that happen, right? We're gonna jump into, Sam asked a great question in a second. So a community run farmers market has more pieces involved, but there are more points of connection and more points to impact change. And again, when you add in your hyper-local growers and your value-added producers, now you create this space in which you can actually generate money for people in the community. So we move through and we look at the notion of community-supported agriculture. You bring your farmer, the same set of people buy into this particular farm. And so now it's a moment when these people, excuse me one second. My doorbell is ringing. Now it becomes a moment when the people who belong to that CSA get to see each other on a regular basis. You get to sustain a local farmer. You get to assure that you have food on a regular basis that is fresh, seasonal, local. CSAs also begin to add in meat, milk, eggs, honey, and other value-added products. And so now what you're doing is you're dissolving the barriers that exist between maybe some of the food that we go to and buy from supermarkets, right? Now you're beginning to empower people to have more autonomy, more sovereignty in how their food comes and where it comes from. And then as an extension of CSA, you also have a wholesaling option. So I, for example, outside of my food work, am really connected to my neighbors, and we have a little strip of restaurants, right? So imagine if we were able to create a CSA in our community and turn around and have that same farmer wholesale to our local restaurants. So what happens if I'm able to get a group of neighbors together, right? To not only make sure that we're buying from the farmer through the CSA, but also that we're supporting the local businesses and making it more affordable for them to have higher quality produce. And these are not like just things that I'm pulling out of the air. For example, through Just Food, I've gone through trainings to set up a farmer's market. There are trainings to set up a CSA. There are trainings to be community food educators. You know, there are other technical supports to get, other technical support so that you can hire market managers. All of these different resources are in place that move us in the direction of empowering community to actually really sustain and help everyone's self. So let's just jump into this chat. Ooh, this chat is exciting. There's so much going on. So the distinction between community-run farmers market and Grow NYC markets, right? So Grow NYC is centrally managed, as Sam pointed out. And the people who decide to actually run a farmer's market, they go through much of the same administrative process to set one up, and they are able to choose who they want. They're able to choose to reach out to, for example, an organization like Just Food to get connected with community chefs if they want to do demos. Or let's say they decide they want to partner with recycling groups to maybe do clothing swaps, right? So when you have a community-run farmers market, now you begin to get into the specifics of what the community needs as opposed to a one-size-fits-all. So if you notice, Grow NYC has a lot of the same vendors throughout their different markets. So you can be a community-run farmers market that decides to be hyper-local, right? Maybe your farmers market is literally just like with the neighborhood I live in, most of my neighbors actually do grow food. So if we ran a farmer's market, everybody could just bring their own food and swap. It may not even be about profit. Maybe it's just about how the kids come together to play together. And then we take the profit to pay community chefs to do demos because that's what we've decided we needed. But we got together and went to organizations like Just Food or Citizens Committee to get training or resources to make that possible. And I see Kiana threw some grant information like a Fresh Connect in the chat box. So that is really good. And yes, so community is a major difference between what you would create and what something like Grow NYC does. So Michelle is saying that she's in Harlem. She, between 2004 and 2008, had little access to fresh, affordable food. And then she would travel outside of the neighborhood, and she didn't realize or understand why until she joined a neighborhood CSA and community garden, right? And then the interactions with these two organizations completely changed my understanding of food access. Yes, 110%. So I tell this quick story, right? One day I'm out walking with my daughter. My daughter is like me, she'll talk to anything, right? A tree, cat, whatever. So we're walking and she hears like a rooster. And she's like, "Mommy, you heard that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, baby, I heard it." So we go and we look, and the neighbor pops out, and they're actually raising chickens. And so she has a whole conversation with this person. And next thing you know, we're getting like fresh heritage eggs like down the block, right? And so here is this opportunity to have this fresh food. It doesn't get much fresher than that, right? Literally, if you go in the morning and the hens haven't laid, you don't get any eggs. And that was right there in a backyard on the next block over. And so when we begin to exist in these community-rooted models of food access, then we begin to learn our neighbors and learn ourselves so much more. And yeah, so Kiana is bringing up really amazing points around the difference between some of the larger markets and smaller run farmers markets. I see East New York Farms is in here, amazing on so many levels, because what East New York Farms has managed to do is really speak for what people in the community need. Folks can have garden plots, they have play streets for the kids. You know, now with COVID, you have bids that are organizing to block off their streets so that people can have fine dining. But in many ways, these same movements were the predecessors to those conversations because they rallied to close off streets so that kids could play, so that you can go to the farmer's market and spend a day out with your children as well. So there are some things that I just wanted to throw out around how we can begin to deconstruct food apartheid through solidarity models that we can actually create for ourselves, right? And again, you don't have to do this alone. Maybe it is a matter of joining an initiative that is existing. Maybe it is a matter of starting something. But right now, as you're on this call, one thing that I do want to call attention to is that there are organizations that can shape and help you at wherever you are in your process, right? So we are going to move forward.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. I love hearing the music. I love the intro. So thank you, Tree, for kind of opening this conversation around solidarity-based models and how food and farming and community kind of connect. I think it's like really important for folks to kind of see. I've been kind of tapping and chatting in the chat, answering some questions around CSAs and farmers markets and the difference between community and stuff, and also like how to, you know, engage with your farmer around in your CSA model. Like, is it just farmer choice, or are there ways that community can inform what the share looks like? And I appreciate Sam's questions as well as Chelsea chiming in as well. So I think there's, you know, while we have, great leadership and expertise, you're learning from some of the best with Sia and Tree. It's also great to connect and lift up some of the partners that are also in the chat. So thanks for sharing your thought leadership and expertise and working knowledge as well in the chat. Keep it going. So, shifting into when we kind of talk about models, I have a quick question that I would love to pose to folks. I'm not going to create a poll, but I'd love to see if there are folks in this chat that are interested in starting within the next couple of months or year a new community food project. Is that something that was on your mind when you came to the training? So if you could just say yes or new, and just write that in the chat real quick, that would be great. Just a quick poll, just curious. And yes. So starting new projects. For me, just expanding Read Solidarity for current work. Yes, great. So no, this is really good to know, because what we were trying to do with these trainings is offer a spectrum of community leaders from new and to existing on ways to either expand the work that they're doing or find ways to connect to existing work and partnerships to address the food justice work that they want to do or increase food access in their community. Or if it was new, like helping folks have those kind of tools to really kind of do the due diligence to think about or think through, is this a project that I think the community needs, or is this a project that community wants, and how to collect and gain that feedback? So what we're gonna focus on in this section is kind of taking that. So if we have this road and building on this, so if we have this road of the grounding of food apartheid, the grounding of food justice, food sovereignty, wanting to kind of connect to models that really speak to solidarity, how do folks, whether you're in a new and existing project, design or plan for these kind of new levels of outreach? How do you determine what's in your community, what isn't, or how to engage? And so here, what we are talking about in this part is we kind of broke it out and thinking about community food projects when you're planning, how to think of some of these bigger categories. And another thing that we wanted to also share was a blueprint design or just like a living worksheet. So while many of you are individuals in work, I think what we're also seeing is how important it is to connect to collective power and how to build with each other. So that's really kind of the first piece when we kind of talk about base building, and see it dropped in the link to this blueprint that we're talking about. So this is something that kind of, this part of the training is to kind of get you primed, to get you excited, but to also kind of put on your radar some of the things to kind of consider and think about when you're embarking on either you know, enhancing your models, or if you're even considering new, because you don't want to just jump in and start. There's a lot of kind of steps that come with it, all feasible, but some steps. And so base building is one important step in base building from the community level. I'm gonna, oh, Sia?
I'm gonna share the blue map.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Awesome. So, yeah, so base building like on the project level. So when we kind of talk about that, we kind of always encourage folks and using this as a tool around community assets. Are you really aware of what's happening in your community? Oftentimes people come to us and say, oh, I need to start a new community food project. There's nothing in my community. And it's like, are you sure? And they're like, yep. And it's like, well, what we always recommend to folks, and they started offering this tool, is like, essentially do like a 10-block radius scan and really, again, like bring that equity lens that we've been kind of talking about to it. And kind of like what Treed mentioned, like walking in your neighborhood, hearing and listening, seeing the different things that are happening that you may have not picked up because you just didn't have that lens. Maybe you know, walking to work or taking a break or getting away from homeschooling, you weren't really focused on, are there existing models and work and partners that are in this community doing this work already? And it's potentially a way to support their work, and that's where the energy and capacity could be. Or is there really a need for something new, and what does quote new look like? But from the beginning, you never really want to start a community food project on your own. So if this is something that you thought you could start on your own, we really recommend people to not do that, because that really fuels the savior complex as opposed to building and galvanizing community power. So identifying some core group folks, whether they're a core group to start a CSA or a core group of folks that are interested in, you know, doing asset mapping and surveys of the community. Are there folks that you're working with that kind of are aligned with your thoughts and are willing to kind of do the due diligence to see and find? Sometimes folks start projects and really, you know, transition out, whether their jobs or lives change. And some people stay on to kind of be that lasting core group that offers that infrastructure. So it's okay to do that, but it really is always important to start with a core group. And I don't say just start with your core friends. I never say that. I think it's starting with your community and really finding either existing neighbors or existing partners or existing groups to really hear from. So pushing yourself to really understand and know your community more. And so when we talk about that, that also leads to like neighborhood. You know, what are existing groups, entities, structures? What are other community assets in your neighborhood? Are there community gardens there? Are there small businesses? Are there daycare centers? Are there other opportunities or assets that are in that? And we, you know, really want folks to start looking at their neighborhoods through a lens of equity, a lens of abundance, not always from a lens of scarcity, or if in fact divesting from that. Because oftentimes when we hear our communities, especially impacted communities or communities of color, it's always from these statistics or just poverty statistics or disconnected statistics. That also kind of drives how sometimes work cannibalizes each other. So you'll have community food projects going after the same funding or going after the same group, as opposed to finding ways to work together, because we're kind of, again, working from a lens of scarcity. If I gotta get mine before you get yours. And that's not really how we're going to build a solidarity economy. And that's not really a way to build community. So, and you know, in terms of thinking about how to expand outreach, it's not just getting numbers, but it might also be new partnerships. What's already in your space? What is the asset of your neighborhood? Is it more community-based? Are there more seniors? Or there more youth? Are those potential avenues for core members and connections? Is there food already coming in? Oftentimes, we encourage folks to look at our value chain map, and you'd be surprised. You think you know your borough, you think you know your neighborhood, and even something as simple as turning on like our map and going in, and then you see all these like icons pop up, and you're like, I didn't realize that there was a CSA coming here already. Well, or nearby. Well, that could potentially be an opportunity for that farmer to come in and go further in your community. That may also identify that maybe it's not a CSA. Maybe you thought you really wanted CSA, and that was the model. Maybe it's actually a farm stand that would be better served in your area. Or working with a partner, you think there's demand to grow into a community-run farmers market where you're vending with multiple folks. The other thing too is, again, we're trying to support projects and models that can live in harmony with each other, support each other, but it's also thinking of the opportunities for regional farm and food, hyper-local farmers and food as well to connect. And these are community assets. And I always kind of tell folks this like statistic of, you know, and I think about the South Bronx. I come from the Bronx. I grew up in more of the West Bronx on Castle Hill. But when people think of the Bronx, they tend to think of the South Bronx. They tend to think of all the statistics we hear. The poorest congressional districts are in the South Bronx. The high diabetes rate, high obesity rates, high asthma rates. But, you know, and we always hear it from that lens. And if we don't really know that community, if we don't really stomp on those grounds or hear from folks, and again, that's another way that we support food apartheid, is marginalizing existing work of folks, you know, and in New York, historically, folks of color that were growing and selling and vending and sharing in those communities when other resources fled. If we don't really hone or connect or see that, even in an area of the South Bronx, even now, folks will, you know, tell me that and tell me that, you know, be on panels and such. And I will always say, that's looking from a lens of scarcity. I'm not minimizing the inequities and impact that people are fighting through or trying to survive through, but we're not talking about why they're dealing with those inequities. We're not talking about the divestment of health and resources, the divestment of living in a residential area that has trucks coming in and out. But what you're also not seeing is a lens of abundance. What you're not seeing is the generations of community gardening and growing. You're not even seeing some of, like, even from an organizational lens, some of our most vibrant, most diverse farmers markets exist or existed in this neighborhood. So the same neighborhood that is still, you know, working through other inequities can still be a place of abundance and opportunity. And so we should never lose that lens. And especially when you're doing a community scan or asset map, that's something to kind of reflect and hold. And that there might be work that's already there happening. There might be work that was there and not resourced or funded, and that's probably why it stopped. Or because it's seasonal, a lot of times what work is happening in the spring and summer, because the harvest in our region is at the most bountiful then, sometimes there'll be sites that pop up during those times, like a CSA, 32 weeks, but some go longer. Our farmers stand, our farm stand, they might try to maximize that time, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It might just be in slumber during the fall and winter. But with the lens of moving forward, and part of why I wanted to ask where folks were at a little bit, just get a temperature check, is, you know, what I think COVID is showing us is not just how important it is to have food access, but how important it is to connect our value chains in our region to our communities? And are we identifying relationships with farmers and partners and community to connect, support, or extend the season of those farmers to get us food, hyper local growers to get us food to turn either into value added products or to have fall and winter root vegetable crops, or to have things that are even produced like meat and protein or grains, something that is already available that we could start freezing now. I think Tree mentioned in session 1, and it's such a really good point, of like, are there ways to connect to models and bring some of that food now and not just think about what we're eating today, but what we're gonna eat when it's winter time. And also, again, thinking about some of those other short-term models, they don't have that infrastructure to hold folks all the way through. So if you're really kind of connecting to existing proven models, you're also likely connecting to farmers that are able to pivot, that either A, already offer extended seasons, or B, could pivot longer to extend their seasons and get food to the community longer. So it really does take understanding what's already coming in and also trying to support our regional procurement as much as possible and those partners.
Right.
Oh yeah, Kelly Street in the Bronx, chef community classes. I think Tree brought up a really good example of community chef work. They're not just for trainings around culinary professions, which they are great opportunities for that, but we kind of utilize our community chef trainings as well. Trainings that Tree and Sia have led for folks in the community to find ways to connect to culinary and preservation and fermenting skills in order to take what we have seasonally and extend that and preserve it for longer periods. And I think these are things that should work in tandem and harmony with food projects. We can't continue to see it as a one and done. Get somebody one bag and that's it. Get them just one box and that's it. We really need to think about how are we getting food into our communities? How do we do this on the long term? What are some of the contacts that we need? Are there community-based organizations that can support grassroots work? Is it worth your project turning into its own business structure, for-profit or nonprofit? It's also important to think about budgeting and costs. While you might want to have a community food project that is rooted in mission, and that's definitely what we encourage, you want to be able to know, like, in the viability of it, are you able to either assess or raise or determine the funds to keep that work operable and viable? So whether or not you make a profit or not, that's not necessarily what's a priority when you're thinking about funding. It's also about, are we able to offer stipends? Are we able to pay for equipment? Are we able to do this on a consistent basis? And what's the cash flow we need to do that? How do we mitigate risk? How do we, pay for the things that we need to make this sustainable? And not just sustainable in food, but sustainable as a model. So, what we hope that this session offers is like the priming and like the groundwork, the percolation of seeing how important equity is in the value chain, supporting procurement, finding ways to also strengthen community leadership from a lens of justice and sovereignty. So if and when you want to impart into a model, whether new and existing, you're continuing to find ways to really loop and connect to a solidary economy. So it's something that everyone in your community can support. There's different ways to do it. You don't have to just be a farmer. You don't have to just be an end consumer. You can be a part of this solidary economy by supporting, by logistics, by facilities and advocating, connecting to policy to ensure what is in your community is something that you want and is actually solving or trying to dismantle the inequities that have been keeping us from resources. And that's ultimately like what we hope that these trainings kind of bring, are ways that are feasible tools and resources, connections to relationships and partners. So it doesn't feel like you need some big nonprofit or charity to do this work around food in your community, that you in fact can do that and do it in partnership in collaboration with others. So I just want to also offer a quick thanks to Tree and Sia and for everybody. Oh, no, I'm going to kick it to you, Tree.
Okay.
But I just wanted to share a thank you. It's been so great evolving these trainings with you both. It's been great engaging with new and existing partners. And I would love to give Tree our final closing in words. And also, like, don't forget to talk about session 3 tomorrow.
Yes, that was like, it sounded like you were closing.
Oh, no.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to encourage everybody to come to session 3 tomorrow, and I'm about to tell you why. So before we close out fully for tonight, there are 2 things that I want to just quickly mention. That in what Kiana was going with, where she was going was talking about the power of functioning in community and as a collective. And in order to do that and do that successfully, there are 2 things that you need: framework and really strong technical assistance. So I want us to think about a framework for some of your solutions to food apartheid from the perspective of funding, right? So I want everybody to take a moment to think about the projects that you have either in your mind for the future or the projects that you hope to expand for the future, and begin thinking about the budgetary concerns around them, right? So what do you need to do to create it or scale up, right? How can you look for resources to begin finding data around the neighborhoods, data around the constituents in the neighborhood, data around who is doing food work in the area? How do you begin to give your thought some legs, right? How do you get it moving? Now, I want to highlight some of the things that Just Food offers in terms of technical assistance, because whether you go to Just Food for technical assistance or not, I at least want some of us who don't know this to know what's possible. So the Just Food network encompasses farmers. It's very heavily reliant on peer-to-peer leadership, because over time, we have found that that works best. So for example, Sia, Kiana, and myself all have different levels of expertise. When we come together, what we're able to do is lean on the other for support with projects to make them go even further beyond what we could have done on our own, right? And because there's that give and take, there's a different level of commitment that you don't have when something is very transactional. Another support that Just Food provides is matchmaking between farmers and producers, right? And that is really important, because whether you're talking about value-added products or whether you're talking about trying to create a market or a CSA, et cetera, you want an organization that can help you meet folks in that respect, right? Also information like value chain maps and databases. Knowledge is power, knowing is power. And it's amazing what happens when you know what is possible. And so connecting into institutions that can kind of give you a strong lens to look at things, right? Other support when you go through the trainings to begin meeting each other. In our last working session, oh my goodness, like people just started connecting so very deeply and literally borrowing each other's ideas, right? And you want to be in environments where more of that percolating is happening. Also, connecting to other organizations that are focusing on equity and capacity building, so that again, as Kiana pointed out, you are not alone. Tools to actually collect your own data and begin to understand how you can utilize them, as well as other trainings, are things that Just Food supports. And of course, real strong assistance with developing policy and advocating for the policy that creates the change that we need in our communities. That was a mouthful. The last thing that I'm going to say, in addition to thank you all for being here and bringing your amazing energy, the chat was so lively, is come tomorrow. And when you come tomorrow, bring to the working session that is at 6, it's a working session tomorrow. Bring your project and bring a burning question that you can use to pivot to a solution that you can enact, whether it's through the winter or through next year, right? Because this is not just about talking, it is about how we build these things together and how we make solidarity and sovereignty real and accessible for everyone around us. And I'm going to kick it back to you, Kiana, for the final last word.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, I think you brought up great points and so many compelling reasons to come to session 3 tomorrow. All I would add is before saying good night, if you yourself can't attend, and say, like, for instance, Chelsea's mentioned she can't make it, not to call you out, but these are prompts for your CSA core group. I encourage folks to send the link for session 3 to your core group members. If you're a new project and you have friends or comrades that you were thinking about building with, send them that link. Whether it shouldn't be just something for you, it should be something you're sharing with your folks. And I did have a rule around session 3, making sure folks join from session 2 and 1. So I realize I just talked myself into something, but I do want to make sure that folks get this, engage as much as possible. So if you've been a part of this and people get that link, just let them know that they're coming for representing your CSA group if you're not able to come individually. And if folks have any questions around registering or how, I'm going to be working on registration for tomorrow's session early, first thing tomorrow. So if there's folks from your CSA core group that you want to tag in, because maybe you're not able to join, let us know, let me know, and I'll make sure they get registered for session 3.
Awesome. Thank you all, and good night.
Night. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.